During an argument, my dad screamed, "You're just a burden. We'd be better off without you." So I packed my things and left that night. 3 weeks later, my sister texted, "Why isn't the mortgage covered this month?" I simply responded, "Guess you're better off without me." The silence after that clarified everything. I, 24M, never thought 17 words could change everything, but here we are. The argument started over something stupid. I'd forgotten to take out the trash again. But when Dad's voice cracked through the house that Tuesday night, screaming that I was just a burden and they'd be better off without me, something inside me snapped clean in half. I stood there in our cramped kitchen, staring at his red face while Mom pretended to be invisible behind her coffee mug. My sister sat at the dining table, scrolling through her phone like nothing was happening. This wasn't new. Dad had been building up to this for months, maybe years. Every missed chore, every late night, every time I'd chosen my friends over family obligations had been ammunition he'd been storing up. But this felt different. Final. I told him he was right. Maybe they would be better off without me. The words came out calm, which seemed to surprise him more than if I'd shouted back. He started backpedaling immediately, saying he didn't mean it, that he was just stressed about work and the bills. Mom finally looked up from her mug and tried to play peacekeeper, suggesting we all just calm down and talk tomorrow. I nodded and said sure, we'd talk tomorrow. Then I went upstairs to my room. By 2 a.m., everything I owned was crammed into 3 duffel bags and my old Honda. I'd been saving money from my job at the warehouse for almost 2 years, originally for college, but this seemed more important now. I left a note on my pillow explaining that I was giving them what they wanted. No drama, no big goodbye scene. Just gone. The first week at the motel was harder than I'd expected. Not because of the lumpy mattress or the weird smell on the carpet, but because of the silence. No dad yelling about dishes in the sink, no mom asking if I'd eaten, no sister complaining about me hogging the bathroom. Just me and the sound of highway traffic through paper-thin walls. I picked up extra shifts at work. My supervisor seemed surprised when I volunteered for overtime, but I needed the distraction. The guys there started inviting me out for beers after shift, and I discovered I actually enjoyed their company without the constant weight of family expectations pressing down on me. My phone buzzed constantly those first few days. Dad calling, Mom texting, even my sister reaching out with uncharacteristic concern. I ignored them all. They'd wanted me gone, so I was gone. Simple as that. By the second week, I'd found a studio apartment across town. Nothing fancy, but it was mine. The landlord was happy to have a tenant who paid first month's rent in cash and didn't ask questions about the lease terms. I bought a mattress, a mini fridge, and a microwave from the thrift store down the street. It felt like playing house, except I was finally the one making all the rules. The calls from home had slowed to a trickle. Mom sent a few texts asking if I was eating well and staying safe. I responded with brief reassurances that yes, I was alive and no, I didn't need anything. Dad tried calling once, but I let it go to voicemail. His message was awkward and stilted, asking me to come home so we could work things out like adults. I deleted it without responding. Work became my anchor. The physical exhaustion from loading trucks and moving inventory left little energy for dwelling on family drama. My supervisor pulled me aside during week 3 and mentioned there might be a promotion opportunity if I was interested. For the first time in months, I felt like I was moving forward instead of just existing. The text from my sister came on a Thursday evening while I was microwaving leftover pizza. She asked why the mortgage wasn't covered this month. I stared at the message for a long time, my dinner growing cold on the counter. Then I understood. For the past 6 years, since I'd graduated high school and started working full-time, I'd been contributing $800 every month to household expenses. Dad had called it rent, but it went straight toward the mortgage payment. I'd never really thought about it as anything more than my fair share for living at home. But apparently, my fair share had become essential to keeping the house. I typed back exactly what Dad had screamed at me that night. Guess you're better off without me. Then I turned off my phone. Update 1. The silence lasted exactly 4 days. When I finally turned my phone back on, I had 17 missed calls and 43 text messages. Dad had apparently tried calling my work, but I'd already talked to my supervisor about keeping my personal life private. The messages ranged from angry demands that I come home immediately to increasingly desperate pleas. Mom's texts were the hardest to read. She explained that they'd been counting on my contribution and couldn't make the full mortgage payment without it. She asked if we could meet somewhere to talk, just the two of us. She said Dad was sorry and that he'd been under tremendous stress at work. My sister's messages were more direct. She wanted to know if I was planning to come back or if they needed to make other arrangements. At least she was being practical about it. The most interesting message came from Dad himself. He admitted that losing my monthly contribution had put them in a difficult position. He asked if I'd be willing to continue helping with the mortgage even if I didn't want to come home. He said we could work out some kind of arrangement. I laughed out loud reading that one. Even when I was gone, I was still just a source of income to him. I decided to respond to Mom first. I told her I was doing well and that I'd found my own place. I said I wasn't angry anymore, but I also wasn't coming back. I suggested she and Dad might want to consider downsizing if the mortgage was unmanageable without my help. To my sister, I was more blunt. I told her they'd have to figure out their financial situation without me. I reminded her that she still lived at home rent-free while working full-time at the bank, so maybe it was time for her to step up. I didn't respond to Dad at all. Update 2. 3 weeks after my sister's mortgage text, Mom showed up at my workplace. I was coming off my shift when I spotted her standing by the employee parking lot, looking completely out of place in her church dress among the industrial buildings. She seemed smaller somehow, older than I remembered. She asked if we could talk, and I found myself nodding despite everything. We drove to a diner downtown, the kind of place that smells like coffee and regret. She told me Dad had been laid off 2 months before our big fight. The company had downsized, and at 54, he was struggling to find comparable work. They'd been living off savings and my monthly contribution, trying to keep everything normal until he found another job. I asked why they hadn't just told me about the situation instead of letting Dad take his frustration out on me every day. She said they'd wanted to protect me from worrying, that they thought Dad would find work quickly. The conversation felt surreal. Here was my mother, asking me to understand why my father had called me a burden, as if unemployment justified emotional abuse. She explained that Dad's pride had been shattered, that he'd been feeling useless and taking it out on everyone around him. I listened to everything she said, then told her I was sorry about Dad's job situation, but that didn't excuse what he'd said to me. I explained that I'd been happier in the past month than I'd been in years. I discovered I actually enjoyed coming home to my own space instead of walking into a minefield every evening. She asked if I'd consider moving back temporarily, just until they got back on their feet. She promised things would be different, that Dad had learned his lesson. I told her no. The hurt in her eyes was real, but so was my resolve. I explained that I'd spent too many years walking on eggshells, trying to be the perfect son who never caused trouble. I'd given up plans for college, worked full-time straight out of high school, and handed over a significant portion of my income without complaint. In return, I'd gotten treated like an inconvenience in my own home. She tried to argue that I was family, that family helps family. I reminded her that family doesn't tell each other they'd be better off dead. The words came out harsher than I'd intended, and I watched her flinch. Before she left, she told me that my sister had been helping with the mortgage since I'd been gone, but it wasn't enough. They were looking at losing the house within a few months if something didn't change. I felt a stab of sympathy, but I also felt something else, freedom. For the first time, their financial crisis wasn't automatically my responsibility to fix. Update 3. 6 months later, I was settling into my new normal when my sister called. She didn't ask for money or demand I come home. Instead, she told me they'd sold the house. Dad had finally found work, but it paid considerably less than his previous job. They'd moved into a 2-bedroom apartment across town. She also told me something I hadn't expected to hear. She'd moved out too. Watching the family house get sold had apparently been a wake-up call for her. She realized she'd been coasting, letting our parents carry her financially while she saved her bank salary for vacations and shopping. She'd gotten her own place and was learning to budget properly for the first time at 26. She said Dad had been different since I'd left. Quieter, more thoughtful. He'd started attending some kind of counseling through his new job's employee assistance program. Mom had suggested family therapy, but Dad felt it was too late for that. The conversation felt strange. We'd never talked like this before, honestly, without the family dynamics getting in the way. She admitted she'd been jealous of the attention I'd gotten, both positive and negative. She said she'd felt invisible, watching Dad either praise my work ethic or tear me down for small mistakes, while she existed somewhere in the middle. She asked if I was happy now, and I realized I could honestly say yes. My life was smaller, simpler, but it belonged entirely to me. I'd gotten that promotion at work, and my supervisor had been talking about management training. I'd started taking community college classes in the evenings, working toward the business degree I'd put off years earlier. Before she hung up, she told me she missed me. Not the me who'd lived at home, walking on eggshells and absorbing everyone else's stress, but the person I'd been before everything got so complicated. She said she was sorry she'd never stood up for me during those fights with Dad. I told her I missed her too, but I didn't miss the person I'd been in that house. Final update. A year and a half after I'd packed my bags in the middle of the night, Dad finally called me. Not to ask for money or demand I come home, but to tell me he was proud of me. He'd heard through my sister that I was doing well in school and had been promoted to supervisor at work. He said he'd driven by my apartment building once, not to bother me, but just to see where I was living. He told me it looked like a good neighborhood. Then he said something that caught me completely off guard. He apologized. Not the half-hearted apology from that first voicemail, but a real acknowledgement of what he'd put me through. He said he'd been seeing a therapist for several months and had come to understand how his unemployment stress had turned into emotional abuse. He said there was no excuse for calling me a burden or suggesting everyone would be better off without me. He told me he'd spent months angry at me for leaving, convinced I'd abandoned the family when they needed me most. But gradually, he'd started to see things differently. He realized I'd been carrying financial responsibility that should have been his, and that instead of being grateful, he'd resented me for being capable when he felt useless. The conversation lasted over an hour. We talked about his new job, my classes, the family's adjustment to their smaller apartment. He told me Mom had framed a photo of me from my high school graduation and kept it on the kitchen table in their new place. At the end of the call, he asked if I'd be willing to meet for coffee sometime. Not to discuss moving home or family obligations, just to talk. He said he understood if I wasn't ready for that, but he hoped someday we could have a relationship that wasn't built on me fixing everyone else's problems. I told him I'd think about it. 3 weeks later, we met at that same diner where Mom and I had talked months earlier. It was awkward at first, but gradually we found our footing. He looked older, more tired, but also somehow lighter. The angry tension that had always surrounded him was gone. He asked about my life, my job, my plans for the future. For the first time I could remember, he seemed genuinely interested in my answers rather than looking for something to criticize or fix. When I told him about my promotion and my progress in school, he smiled. Not the forced, complicated smile I remembered from home, but something real and uncomplicated. We've been meeting for coffee every few weeks since then. The relationship is different now, built on mutual respect rather than financial dependency. He doesn't try to give me advice unless I ask for it, and I don't feel responsible for managing his emotions. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I'd stayed home that night, if I'd absorbed his anger and continued living in that suffocating dynamic. I probably would have given up on school permanently, worked myself into exhaustion trying to keep everyone financially afloat, and never learned what it felt like to make decisions based on what I wanted rather than what everyone else needed. That 17-word outburst destroyed one version of our family, but it also gave us the chance to build something healthier from the ground up. The house they lost was just a building. The family we're creating now, with clear boundaries and honest communication, feels more like home than that place ever did.